Authoritarianism always begins with a promise. The promise of strength, speed, and control. Decisions made overnight. Skyscrapers rising in months. Enemies crushed before they can even react. It looks efficient, even admirable. But what we mistake for power is often just mimicry, a performance. A show designed to look impressive while hiding decay. Like butterflies with eyes on their wings pretending to be predators. Like harmless ants mimicking spiders to avoid being eaten. Entire regimes learn to fake success in order to survive. And no country has mastered that art quite like Russia. I am Elvira Bary, a writer born in the Soviet Union, and today we'll uncover how Putin's Russia turned illusion-making into a system, a machinery of deception so polished that even the West sometimes believes it's real. Here's our roadmap for today. The illusion of triumph. How to tell when Russia is faking success. The logic of pretending. Why build an empire of illusions instead of real progress? The art of deception. The propaganda techniques that fool even the powerful. The inevitable. Why the age of political impostors is coming to an end. If you'd like to follow my upcoming novel, The Snow Queen's Spring, a story about the war in Ukraine and the people caught between two worlds, you can subscribe to my newsletter using the link in the description. You'll get early chapters, behind-the-scene research, and a closer look at how history becomes story. And if you find value in my work and want to help this channel stay independent, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. You can also support my research and production through Think Tank membership. Buy me a coffee, PayPal, or Super Thanks right here on YouTube. Every bit of your support helps me keep creating thoughtful, fact-based content in a world that's drowning in noise and manipulation. Now, let's begin. And let's start with the first illusion. The illusion of triumph. For most of history, the success or failure of a state was determined in simple terms. Either it conquered or it was conquered. Weak states disappeared, but with the rise of mass media and the growing cost of war, even inefficient regimes discovered a new way to survive. They no longer needed real strength, only the illusion of it. The Soviet Union mastered this art of inflated greatness. In fact, its entire post-war history was built on pretending to be stronger, richer, and more advanced than it really was. The country lived far worse than its main rival, the United States, and lagged well behind Western Europe in recovery and development. West Germany, devastated after the war, rebuilt its economy within 2 decades and even surpasses its pre-war level by most measures. Even the so-called Soviet satellites, Poland, Czechoslovakia, enjoyed higher living standards than the citizens of the empire itself. It was a strange paradox. The Soviet Union, the victorious metropolis, was poorer than its colonies. The reason was simple. Communist theory had failed. It simply couldn't generate enough resources or innovation to keep pace with the West. But admitting that the ruling ideology was wrong was unthinkable. That's where psychology came in. The Soviet leadership fell into a classic cognitive trap known as the sunk cost fallacy, continuing to invest in a losing cause simply because so much had already been spent. Politicians kept postponing their reckoning, shifting the cost of their mistakes onto future generations. So the Soviet state turned illusion-making into an industry, and in that one field, it achieved genuine excellence. It built gigantic construction projects meant to showcase power, poured resources into the military, sports, and display art like ballet and cinema, anything that could distract from the reality of shortages and decline. It even produced entire artistic movements whose main purpose was to decorate Soviet life with a glossy layer of heroism and joy. Modern Russia inherited this machinery of deceit in full and uses it just as effectively. Like its predecessor, it constructs layers of falsehood to form a coherent illusion. The constitution and laws are filled with elegant promises about freedom of speech and democracy, none of which are respected. Elections take place, but real candidates are never allowed to run. It's a staged ritual of public will. The economy, too, is no longer truly a market. Major sectors are controlled by the state, from key commodity prices to import and export permissions. The president speaks of growth, while his own ministers admit that everything is shrinking and will only get worse. The government doesn't even pretend to care that its words contradict its actions. It promised not to raise the retirement age, and did. Promised not to increase taxes, and did. Swore there would be no war, and launched one. It fabricates external threats to keep the public fearful. It invents enemies to justify aggression. It even lies to its own supporters. Veterans of the war were told they'd become the new elite, yet they are excluded from power and privilege. But how do you convince your own citizens that an authoritarian regime is better than a democracy? There are two main ways. First, you accuse democracies of imaginary sins and feed people conspiracy theories that offer simple explanations for complex realities. Stories that, not by accident, echo the ancient myths and legends we've heard since childhood. That's why they feel so natural, so easy to believe. These narratives are practically coded into our minds alongside fairy tales, religious parables, and urban legends. You claim that America is a kind of dark lord whose only goal is to enslave the world and steal people's souls. That Europe is drowning in moral decay, kidnapping children from normal families, and promoting homosexuality in schools. Yes, they may live better there, the argument goes, but do you really want to sell your children's future for comfort and money? The second method is to praise authoritarian efficiency. In a democracy, politicians argue endlessly. Parliaments bicker, and decisions take years. In an autocracy, a single wise leader makes a decision, and everyone obeys. Sounds convenient, doesn't it? Except it's not. Because speed means no debate, no checks, no weighing of consequences. And the price of a mistake can be catastrophic. That's exactly what happened when Vladimir Putin decided to invade Ukraine. He simply announced it, and no one dared to object. Authoritarian regimes are also praised for their ability to concentrate resources in a few hands, supposedly allowing them to launch grand national projects. But here too the risks are enormous. The Soviet Union built countless great constructions, consuming vast sums and the lives of hundreds of thousands of prisoners. Most of those projects turned out to be useless. Monuments to wasted effort, bringing neither profit nor progress. And there's another powerful factor. Authoritarian and totalitarian regimes are masters at exploiting our deep human hunger for spectacle, for that intoxicating feeling of belonging to something larger than ourselves. Democracies may excel at festivals and carnivals, but their military parades look almost timid compared to the choreographed pageantry of China or even North Korea. In free societies, artists struggle and compete for funding, attention, and meaning, which makes it difficult to create a single, unified visual identity for a nation. But authoritarian regimes, with their centralized control and understanding of propaganda, can pour immense resources into crafting their own grand aesthetics. And those images, vast, synchronized, emotionally charged, awaken something primal in us. They feel powerful. They even look beautiful. Remember the chilling perfection of Nazi rallies. That's the same spell at work. The logic of pretending. But why pretend instead of building real achievements? Because authoritarian societies simply can't keep up with democracies. And this failure is rooted in a deep conflict between the archaic and the modern. Over centuries of bloody trial and error, humanity discovered a system that allows not just the division of resources, but their steady growth, so that the well-being of every person slowly improves. But this system works only under one condition. Society must not be divided into castes. People who are willing to learn, work, and create must have a real chance to rise through their own intelligence and effort. In democracies, competition is normal. It drives innovation and progress. But in authoritarian regimes, competition is a threat. Allowing others to rise means creating rivals for those who already sit at the top. And in such systems, the upper caste sees power as sacred, something to be inherited, not challenged. Traditional power structures were built around the leader and his inner circle. He was not elected. He seized power by force and claimed the right to rule. Once in control, he did everything possible to stay there. That model worked only in small tribes, where everyone knew the leader personally and could hold him accountable. But when rulers began to isolate themselves behind ceremonies, palaces, and guards, something changed. Their tribe became their immediate entourage, while the rest of the population turned into a resource, something to be exploited and redistributed among loyal allies. This pattern has not changed since the days of the Sumerian kings. The instinct to protect one's own circle at the expense of everyone else still defines authoritarian rule. Even in modern democracies, we see traces of this instinct in nepotism and political favoritism. But systems of checks and balances, along with limited terms in office, keep it somewhat under control. In democracies, leaders must at least pretend to care about the well-being of their voters. That pressure creates an environment where innovation can flourish. But in authoritarian systems, the opposite happens. Power becomes permanent. Positions go to members of favorite clans. Law becomes an instrument of the ruler's will. And when the rule of law disappears, people lose their basic sense of security for their lives, their families, and their property. When that happens, anyone with intelligence or resources looks for a way out. Capital flees. So do the best minds. That's why authoritarian countries, no matter how loudly they boast, can truly compete with democracies. Their brightest people leave, not because they hate their homeland, but because they don't want to live in fear. Russia, China, and others can puff out their chest and talk about technological breakthroughs, but to see the truth, you only need to look at where scientists immigrate and where investors put their money. The direction of that flow tells the real story. Have you ever heard of American entrepreneurs moving their families to Russia? Of course not. Why? Because none of those grand programs or slogans about the traditional values matter in a country where human rights and private property are meaningless. It's easy to fool people who have nothing at stake. Those who don't speak the language, don't know the system, and don't risk their own money. From afar, Russia can look powerful and mysterious, but up close, the illusion dissolves. And that's the tragedy of authoritarian elites. They face an unsolvable dilemma. Support the regime, and you keep your position. But you also create a country where no one wants to invest or raise children. So you send your own money and family abroad. Compete with democracies under those conditions, and you lose. But if you reform the system, allow free elections, the rule of law, and limits on power, you lose control. You can't steal from the budget anymore. You can't pass stolen wealth to your heirs. And the new democratic government might even prosecute you for past crimes. There's no good way out. That's why authoritarian rulers double down on propaganda, to convince both the world and themselves that everything is fine, that all societies are corrupt in the same way, that the West just hides it better. And here lies the ultimate irony. Those who commission the propaganda end up believing it. Authoritarian leaders surround themselves with flatterers because it feels good to be adored. It's a basic human instinct. We all prefer people who praise us and make us feel secure. But when power can't be challenged, flattery turns into corruption. And corruption spreads like rust through every layer of society. That corruption eats away at the system from within, accelerating its decay. The result is always the same. An empire that still looks solid from the outside, but inside it's already collapsing. The art of deception. Why do people fall for these economic and political miracles that authoritarian regimes love to advertise? Because most people prefer not to waste energy studying something distant or complex. If the regime gives you the first picture, your brain says, "Okay, I get it," and moves on. If you hear the same message repeated across multiple channels, it starts to feel like truth. You stop looking for alternatives. And since there aren't many experts on authoritarian systems, and the few who exist either don't speak English or write for academic audiences instead of ordinary readers, it's hard to fight back against professional propaganda. The result is painfully visible. When Putin invaded Ukraine, the West hesitated. Too many believed that Russia was stronger than it was, that confronting it would bring disaster. That hesitation cost the world dearly, hundreds of thousands of lives, billions in losses, and a war that should never have begun. How does Russia manage to impress both its enemies and its own people? The answer lies in two-directional performance, one aimed outward, the other inward. To the outside world, Russia projects two main illusions. First, it cultivates the image of a reckless fanatic, a regime so irrational that it might burn the entire world in a nuclear war. This is what political theorists call the madman theory, where a leader deliberately appears unhinged to intimidate opponents and gain leverage in negotiations. The idea is simple. If others believe you might act irrationally, they will do anything to avoid provoking you. In reality, though, none of the Soviet leaders were madmen. They were men who valued comfort, luxury, and admiration. They only pretended to be warriors in plain suits, champions of the working class ready to die for the cause. It was a costume, a role performed for the cameras. Second, Russia needed to show that it possessed infinite resources. That illusion requires spectacle, parades, military drills, Olympic Games, any event that could fill the screen with synchronized movement and shiny metal. Because when people Even experienced diplomats and generals see endless marching columns and roaring tanks. They instinctively feel awe. It's a human reflex. Mass equals power. And when you see a fanatic with infinite resources, what do? You try to calm him down. You appease him, which is precisely the point. Inside the country, however, a completely different narrative is delivered. Our leader is calm and wise, and he has a great plan for the great country. We are thriving, and if you personally aren't, it's just a local glitch. The supreme leader is always right. If something goes wrong, blame the lower officials. If you protest, you are an enemy of the people, a traitor, a lunatic, or an exile. Resistance is useless. Politics is dirty, so stay away from it. Evil foreign powers want to steal our sacred wealth, so support your leaders. Only they can save you. To the outside world, the message is, trust your eyes. What you see is real. To the inside world, don't trust your eyes, will tell you what's real. The goal is always the same, to ensure that those in privileged position remains there forever. The art of deception relies on exploiting universal human cognitive flaws. The most effective one is the focusing effect. Our tendency to concentrate on the one striking detail and ignore everything else. When people are bombarded with impressive, emotional, and frightening information, they lose the ability to analyze the full picture. If you make Western politicians focus on Russia's nuclear threats, its readiness to end the world, they'll have no time to consider its crumbling economy, dependency on oil exports, or demographic collapse. There are only 24 hours in a day, and world leaders already juggle crises from Hamas to Venezuela, from Iran to China. The less attention they have left for Russia's true weaknesses, the safer the illusion remains. Another common trick is overgeneralization, when people take one example and apply it to everything. That's how xenophobia works. You meet one bad migrant, and suddenly all migrants seem dangerous. The same psychology works in a reverse. Show someone a few examples of prosperity, and they'll assume the entire country is doing well. That's how the USSR fooled Western visitors. Foreign writers were taken to the best restaurants and theaters, shown the glittering boulevards of Moscow, and treated like honored guests. They returned home and swore there was no repression. I saw it with my own eyes. The same theater continues today. Another manipulation is our tendency to ignore the cost of a spectacle. When we see a grand event, a military parade, an Olympic ceremony, or a new mega project, we rarely ask, how much did this cost and who paid for it? Russian authorities love to show how beautifully Crimea has flourished since annexation. But they never mention that Crimea is under sanctions, that its population has been forcibly changed, that property was seized by FSB officers and their associates. The entire carnival of rebirth exists only because resources are being drained from the rest of Russia. In Perm or Saransk, fewer schools are built, fewer roads repaired, and cancer patients are consoled with sympathy instead of treatment. The inevitable. The tragedy of Putin and of every authoritarian ruler is that their ambitions run against the current of history. The river of progress always flows toward greater access to education, mobility, and self-realization for more and more people. But autocrats dream of damming that river, of freezing time, of stopping history itself. They believe absolute power is a natural order, a divine privilege granted to chosen men. In truth, they simply misunderstand history. Absolute power is never granted by heaven. It's created by circumstances, by violence, charisma, luck, or technology. Think of Alexander the Great or the first emperor of China, Qin Shi Huangdi. Both built vast empires through personal genius and brutal force. Yet, as soon as they died, the empires fell apart. Their power was personal, not systematic. For centuries, European monarchs could not be truly absolute either. They depended on their feudal lords, men who supplied their knights and armies. In those days, battles were won by warriors trained from childhood and supported by entire villages. A knight couldn't be mass-produced. He required lifelong preparation and wealth. That gave his lord real independence from the crown. Everything changed with the arrival of gunpowder. Suddenly, a king could arm any peasant with a musket and defeat the finest knight. Soldiers no longer needed land or titles. They fought for pay or even for food, as long as discipline was enforced. And since only monarchs could afford to produce firearms at scale, power shifted decisively to the center. Absolute monarchy was born from the cheapness of violence. Armies became vast, loyalty became replaceable, and human life expendable. That pattern survived well into the 20th century. The German, Soviet, and Chinese empires all relied on the same principle. Soldiers were cheap, obedience was mandatory, and human lives were the raw material of victory. But in the 21st century, everything changed. First, life itself became more valuable. Families no longer had 7 or 8 children. They had 1 or 2. Second, modern warfare now favors intelligence over muscle. The winners are those who can cultivate minds, people who design drones, program artificial intelligence, and build advanced microchips. You can train an uneducated soldier to operate a drone, but you cannot train him to invent the next generation of drones. That requires education, creativity, and freedom of thought. The very things authoritarian systems suppress. So the choice is simple. Either a state invests in education and raises a generation of thinkers, or it loses the wars of the future. Yet, educated people do not tolerate absolute power. They question it. They demand rights, opportunities, and fair pay. They want to live, not just obey. Education is the natural enemy of tyranny, because the habit of learning expands beyond the technical. It spills into the moral and the political. The moment people begin to think critically, autocracy begins to die. That is why progress will eventually destroy authoritarian regimes, if not from within, then through defeat on the battlefield. History has already chosen its direction. Whenever we are tempted to admire the efficiency or stability of an authoritarian government, there are 3 questions worth asking. Are its rulers hiding basic data on finances, demographics, or trade that businesses and policymakers need to make rational decisions? If so, it's not protection, it's fear. Healthy nations don't hide information from their own citizens. Are they restricting free speech and seizing control of the media? They are terrified of the truth. Suppressing feedback is not a sign of strength. It's a confession of weakness. Do they punish those who tell inconvenient truths? If yes, they are already destroying the very people who could save them in times of crisis. Scientists, thinkers, journalists, and innovators. If the answer to these questions is yes, then no amount of parades, statistics, or televised triumphs can be trusted. The numbers are fake, the victories are illusions, and the system, no matter how confident it appears, is already collapsing under its own lies. And now, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Why do you think authoritarian, even totalitarian regimes still have admirers beyond their borders? Is it the dark aesthetics, the projection of raw power, or the bitterness of people disappointed with their own politicians, longing for a tough guy to set things right? Tell me what you think in the comments. Thank you for watching, for thinking, and for staying curious. See you in the next video.